Today is my own gift.
Truman Capote. He was one of the most gifted and self-destructive writers of the post-war generation. Capote's lyrical prose is best illustrated in the classics Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood.
His weapon was his wit, which he could use in a very friendly way or he could use in a very, very nasty way.
Truman Capote's writing made him famous, but it was his flamboyant personality and flair for the dramatic that made him unforgettable. On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll explore Truman Capote's rise to celebrity stardom and his reign as court jester to the rich and famous.
He really literally did know everybody. He gave a very famous black and white ball in New York. He was really in with the in crowd.
We'll also examine the mystery of the still missing chapters of Capote's final novel.
It could be in Palm Springs, it could be in Chicago, it could be a lot of places.
And we'll reveal the fatal mistake that made Capote an outcast.
He was a pariah. He became, to the whole social set, someone you never talked about and you never saw.
I'm A.J. Benza. Join me as we take a look at the private demons that destroyed a fragile genius, the tiny terror, Truman Capote. Like many great artists, Truman Capote came from humble beginnings. He was born Truman Streckfus Persons on September 30th, 1924 in New Orleans. Gerald Clark is the author of the biography, Capote.
His parents came from Alabama. His mother came from a little town called Monroeville. Her name was Lily Mae Falk, and his father, whose name was Arch Persons. His father was a charmer. Truman's mother soon discovered was that Arch Persons was a con man.
Truman's father, Arch, was frequently in trouble with the law. He found it difficult to support a small family. Lily Mae didn't want to waste her youth saddled with a deadbeat husband and kid, so in 1930, Lily Mae left 6-year-old Truman in the care of some relatives back in Monroeville while she hit the road for New York City. Celebrated author George Plimpton wrote a biography of Truman Capote.
I think she was one of those very beautiful young women who simply felt burdened by having a child, left them and went to New York to try to live a much more social life.
Joanne Carson was one of Truman's closest friends.
She would come and visit and then leave. She wasn't really motherly in that way. So she was always leaving Truman, and Truman was always feeling abandoned.
Capote's attorney and friend, Alan Schwartz.
His mother was a woman who really didn't raise him at all, and his father was someone who he had been in jail, he hardly ever knew. And so he was brought up by these strange cousins, which are reflected in Christmas Memory and Thanksgiving Visitor, two of the short novels he wrote.
A Christmas Memory is the most autobiographical of all of Truman's pieces. It's a story of his relationship with his Aunt Sook in the South. It's the story of the togetherness of the two of them.
Young Truman also developed a close relationship with the girl next door, Harper Lee, who would later rise to fame as the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. There wasn't much for Truman and Harper to do in Monroeville but pass the time inventing stories.
He kept a little book on which he wrote words he hadn't heard. He was always looking in the dictionary. He wasn't interested in sports or any of the normal games that kids play. He wanted to become a writer almost from the time he could talk.
In 1933, Truman's mother, who changed her first name to Nina, remarried. Joe Capote was a New York businessman who satisfied Nina's social and financial requirements. 8-year-old Truman was summoned to the Big Apple to live with his mother and new father.
Joe Capote, his stepfather, legally adopted him, and Truman changed his name to Capote at that time.
As a boy, Truman paid little attention to his studies. However, as he grew older, Capote did pay attention to, well, to the other boys.
He discovered that he was gay only because other boys were attracted to him. I don't think it was something that happened in the South as much as it blossomed when he was in New York.
Truman was blessed or cursed with this little high voice.
I don't know. I think people really enjoyed it.
Anybody that met him for the first time bespoke the fact that he was a raving homosexual.
homosexual is a gentleman who just left the room. No.
Truman was always a 12-year-old boy. His voice never grew past that.
In 1942, fresh out of high school, 18-year-old Truman landed his first job at the prestigious New Yorker magazine.
When I was 16, 17, I just decided I wasn't going to go to college. I went to work at the New Yorker.
New Yorker was the place to be for a kid who was interested in writing, and Truman was desperate to get there. He was hired as a copyboy.
Capote's bold personality, combined with his tiny frame and gentlemanly Southern charm, endeared him to many, including a guy named Jack Dunphy. Truman met Jack in 1948.
He and Truman had a very intense relationship, had lived together for many years.
Truman seduced him just as he did everybody else. Jack was a very attractive man, very athletic.
In 1948, 24-year-old Truman also experienced his first taste of success with a novel titled Other Voices, Other Rooms.
Gothic novel. Mostly about a young boy's, 13-year-old boy's, coming to grips with his sexuality.
So the back cover of Other Voices, Other Rooms was a portrait taken of Truman lying on a sofa with a sort of come hither look. And I think probably most people began to think of Truman as a self-promoter and rather suspicious of the work itself.
Sounds to me like Truman knew exactly what he was doing. By his mid-20s, Capote had already established himself as a new breed of writer, and the little guy was just getting started. Coming up, hot-blooded killers and cold-blooded socialites. 4-year-old Truman Capote grabbed attention with his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, an autobiographical coming-of-age story. Capote followed up with several short stories, a screenplay, and his second novel, The Grass Harp. And then in the early days of 1954, tragedy struck.
Truman had always had a difficult relationship with his mother. In later years, she was an alcoholic. She would make fun of him for being homosexual. Things had got tougher for her. Joe Capote had really spent over his head. He was embezzling. He was going to go to Sing Sing. They were about to catch him, and she couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept the fact that this is where she would be, and offered. So she committed suicide.
Truman was devastated, but Capote continued writing, mostly short stories, as well as his classic novella Breakfast at Tiffany's. The story about Holly Golightly was published in 1958 and immediately turned into a Hollywood film starring Audrey Hepburn. The following year, 35-year-old Truman found the inspiration for what is considered his greatest work.
Truman had seen this item in the New York Times about these murders in Kansas. Entire family wiped out.
In November of 1959, a wealthy wheat farmer, his wife, and 2 teenage children were tied up and shot to death at their home in Holcomb, Kansas. Capote decided to chronicle the story in a non-fiction novel and headed for the Midwest to begin his research.
He took Harper Lee with him to help him with the relations with the townsfolk.
First day, they got to the FBI headquarters in Kansas. Truman walked in, he said, all these guys started to titter, you know, there was this little guy. And Truman walked up to the biggest guy and grabbed him by the tie and said, listen, I'm here and I'm Truman Capote and I'm better than all you guys, and if you want to do something about it, let's go out and do it right now.
When 35-year-old Truman wasn't busy making new friends, he was working with Harper Lee to piece together the story of the Clutter family murders. On December 30th, 1959, 2 suspects were arrested. Their names were Dick Hickok and Perry Smith, former inmates from Kansas State Penitentiary. The pair were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Capote befriended the killers in jail.
They were very suspicious of him. Eventually, they started corresponding on death row. And Truman became a mentor, in a way, to Perry. Perry was the more disturbed of the two, I think, and Truman identified with him and had a crush on him as well. The most chilling remark Perry made was, I really admired Mr. Clutter right up until the moment I cut his throat.
He's a real swell guy. Capote spent the next 5 years writing the book which he called In Cold Blood.
I think he probably thought it was the best work he ever wrote as a big work.
He knew fairly quickly that it would be a great success, and that's what made it so frustrating, because he couldn't publish until after the execution of these 2 killers, who became his friends in a way.
Smith and Hickok were put to death on April 14, 1965. Truman was finally able to complete the last chapter of his nonfiction novel. In Cold Blood was published in late 1965. The book was a bestseller and became an instant classic. After spending 5 long years writing the book, Capote was ready to kick back and celebrate. And Truman decided to throw a party for his good friend, Washington Post editor Katharine Graham. The exclusive black and white ball became the social event of the decade.
1966, Truman gave this black and white ball. The invitation said that you had to wear a mask. It was in the Plaza Hotel. I think one of the more astonishing things about the ball was that it was the sort of cross-section of society that was there.
I think the reason was it was such a wide variety of people from all over the world. It was an extraordinary thing in its way, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it was just a private party in my business and nobody else's. But
The party was a major hit and launched a playful chapter of Capote's life. Syndicated columnist Liz Smith.
His talent just paved the way for him, and his personality too. He was very engaging and playful and full of gossip and fun, and he was smart. Very sophisticated group of people in the international set embraced him. I think he was like a pet to them. He was amusing and cute and beguiling.
And of course, his great friendships were with these high society women. These women he called the Swans. And they were Babe Paley, who was the wife of William Paley, the head of CBS. I think they treated him rather as a toy, perhaps. They liked him because they could tell him their confidences, how dismayed they were with their own private lives. He was a wonderful listener, wonderful storyteller. He would always tell them to tell me about your life, and they would make the mistake of doing this.
By the late 60s, Truman Capote became a national celebrity with a growing passion for party drugs. He enjoyed the high life with his jet-set friends, but not for long. Just ahead, Truman dishes the dirt and gets buried by his society friends. In 1965, 41-year-old Truman Capote was anxious to write another masterpiece. Capote spent the next decade collecting material for a novel he planned to write, chronicling the exploits of his uptown friends. He called the project Answered Prayers.
He wrote Answered Prayers because he wanted to document the life of the beautiful people. Even with all the money and all the cars and the homes and the beauty and the intelligence, they were still as sad as everybody else. They didn't have anything that special outside of the money.
Cote Basque is a chapter which takes place in the restaurant, the Cote Basque in New York, and it is we're eavesdropping on these women in their various conversations about their husbands, their lovers, people in their lives who are all famous people. And it's extremely funny, very gossipy, very bitchy, and unfortunately very much identifiable.
I recall saying to him, you know, Truman, they're not going to be happy when they read this. And he said, nah, they're too dumb. They won't know who they are. But they did.
The first chapters of Answered Prayers were published in Esquire magazine in 1975. Truman Capote's socialite friends were furious. They felt betrayed. Liz Smith covered the story for New York magazine.
He felt that his talent, his great talent in repeating this stuff would override anybody's objection to it being about them. Well, it didn't. I mean, even the harmless parts of it, people took exception to.
Society luminaries like William and Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and Lee Radswell completely snubbed Capote. Joanne Carson was one of the few friends who stood by Truman.
First of all, Truman never wrote about anything that wasn't already common knowledge. In other words, La Cote Basque was something that everybody in New York knew about. And it had been talked about for a long time. Truman just took it and lifted it and put it into a framework of a beautiful piece.
It had a huge impact on all these people with this story, and they reacted very violently towards it. And that was the end of Truman with them.
He paid a heavy price because he was ostracized in a way that is hard to imagine anybody now. It couldn't be done now. Nobody would care now. But in 1975, people did care. And Babe Paley, who was his best friend, dropped him entirely.
Truman was crushed. Only 4 chapters of Answered Prayers were ever published. By the late 1970s, Capote, now in his 50s and deeply depressed, was writing less, partying more and drifting away from longtime companion Jack Dunphy.
Truman had a great deal of dependency on these people for his social life, for his sort of general feeling of well-being, because he was a kind of a weird-looking guy and a weird guy, and these people were his whole social support, and they were pretty high up in the world. So I think fear and panic became a factor in the equation and led to an increase in the drugs and the drink and things like that.
He drank a lot. He took drugs. And at that point in his life, he started going to Studio 54 like a mad fiend. And you'd go in Studio 54 and he'd be there like a whirling dervish.
I mean, it's totally integrated, both sexually and ethnically.
And I was once in his house when he came to me with a big bowl of white powder and said, "This is the greatest cocaine in the world and we're going to have it." And I'm like just sitting there stunned.
Truman's nonstop carousing began to destroy his small body.
Well, I've been in practically every hospital in America you can think of.
In 1982, Truman's doctor called Alan Schwartz to relay some tragic news.
We have found that his brain has shrunk a certain number of millimeters. And I said, well, what does that mean? That means that if he doesn't stop drinking, he will be dead in 6 months.
It looked like the writing was on the wall for Truman Capote. Just ahead, Truman's final chapter and the search for the missing manuscript. Author Truman Capote made a lot of people very angry when he revealed their secrets in a piece called Answered Prayers. After being dumped by his jet-set pals, Capote began to slowly unravel. By 1980, 56-year-old Truman was in a dark depression. Despite desperate attempts by friends to get Capote clean and sober, he was hell-bent on self-destruction.
The reason that he drank was because he said he felt like a blue serge suit that just picked up everything that came by, and sometimes he just had to shut down.
At the end of his life, he went on talk shows where he was incoherent and clearly drunk. His physical appearance deteriorated, so he was slovenly.
All right, but the obvious answer is that eventually, I'll kill myself without meaning to.
I remember once saying to him, and seeing him take sleeping pills with a glass of wine, I said, "Truman, those will put you in oblivion." And he said, "Sometimes oblivion is a nice place to be."
By the summer of 1984, Truman lost the will to live.
He woke up in the morning, we were supposed to go for a swim, and he didn't feel good, and he looked very pale. As he was holding my hand, I had my hand on his pulse, and it was fluttery. And I said to him, "Truman, I think there's some problems here." And he said, "No, no more hospitals, no more IVs, no more doctors. If you love me, let me go." And I don't know at what point it was that he left, but all of a sudden he was gone.
Truman Capote died in the home of Joanne Carson on August 25, 1984. Capote was 1 month shy of his 60th birthday. Before Truman died, Joanne Carson asked him about the final chapters of Answered Prayers.
The morning that he was dying, I said, "You can't die, Truman. You haven't finished Answered Prayers." He said, "Oh, yes, I have. You've read all the chapters." And I said, "Well, where are they?" He said, "They're in a safety deposit box." Safely in a safety deposit box, with some money and some instructions. I've paid for an advance, and they'll be there for some time. And when the time is up, they'll be sent to Random House.
And we looked everywhere we could think of for this book, and all I can tell you is we never found it.
I believe they do exist. I believe at some point they will show up, but I don't know how many years he paid for the safety deposit box. He did say to me that he picked a bank that will be there for quite some time.
Capote wasn't exactly thinking logically in his final years. The missing chapters could be anywhere, but Truman left behind much more than a few unpublished pages.
His writing is his legacy, and that's what will remain. And eventually the rest of it will be forgotten.
He's taken his place as one of the great American writers, and nothing's going to change that.
He had an ear for the music of the English language that no writer of his generation had.
Truman taught me total acceptance. I'm a much better person for having known him, because if you love Truman, you accepted him. And that's a great gift, to be able to learn to be totally accepting of other people.
Most people don't know the difference between good, very good, and superb. And he was superb.
Truman Capote was quite a character. He wrote some good books and lived his life to the fullest. If those missing chapters from Answered Prayers ever show up, Truman will be a celebrity all over again. In a way, his prayers will be answered. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we take a look at the men behind the myths on Mysteries and Scandals.